Okay, let's dive right into this explainer and unpack a truly fascinating historical mystery, the story of the Angles. We're talking about a tribe whose legacy is literally stamped on the very name of England itself, yet their actual origins kind of shrouded in shadows. We're going to explore exactly why they packed up and migrated to Britain, who they traveled with, where they actually settled, and how this seemingly invisible group of everyday farmers ended up completely rewriting the cultural DNA of an entire island. Now, there's this incredible etymological paradox right at the heart of British history. I mean, everybody knows that England literally translates to land of the Angles. But if you dig into early classical Roman history, the Angles were practically invisible. Roman chroniclers were constantly complaining about the Saxons, but the Angles? Barely a footnote. They just didn't register on the Roman radar in the same way. You've probably heard that broad umbrella term Anglo-Saxon, right? But we really need to pause and ask who were the Angles specifically and what on earth made them leave their homeland? Historically, they lived in a region called Angle. That's in modern-day Schleswig-Holstein, right at the base of the Jutland Peninsula. Classical writers like Tacitus put them in the Subic Confederacy. This was basically a big network of tribes bound together by shared religious practices like worshiping the goddess Nerthus. So, what turned these localized, deeply rooted folks into massive waves of migrants? Well, the crucial thing to understand here is the stark contrast between them and their infamous neighbors. While Roman texts were practically screaming about piratical Saxon raiders terrorizing the imperial coasts, the Angles were actually just relatively quiet agriculturalists. They absolutely did not have that same reputation for maritime piracy. When the Great Migration period kicked into high gear, the Angles definitely traveled across the North Sea in the exact same massive wave as the Saxons and the Jutes. But here's the kicker. They weren't this unified, conquering army. They were distinct communities, moving for entirely different reasons than just raiding for loot. So, to really understand why this invisible tribe of farmers suddenly packed up everything and left their ancestral homeland behind, we have to look at a massive environmental push factor. They weren't just out looking for conquest, They were literally fleeing an ecological catastrophe. To put that into perspective, look at this number. During what's known as the Rottnest Marine Transgression, which peaked right around 300 AD, sea levels in the North Sea basin shot up an astonishing 4.0 meters in just 70 years. Just imagine being a coastal farmer today and watching the ocean swallow up your fields at a rate of nearly 6 centimeters every single year. For a single lifetime, that is a localized apocalypse. And this ecological collapse totally devastated their way of life. See, for generations, these coastal communities lived on these artificial dwelling mounds called terps, just to stay above the tides. But those rapidly rising waters salinized all their good farming land, and eventually it just flooded the terps entirely. The archaeological evidence is crystal clear here. Large settlements and cremation cemeteries in the England homeland were almost totally abandoned. It left them with absolutely no choice but to launch a highly organized, large-scale migration straight across the North Sea to the stable, higher ground of sub-Roman Britain. Now, for a long time, historians argued about whether this was just an elite replacement, a small handful of warriors swooping in and taking over. But incredible data from a massive 2022 Nature study tells us a wildly different story. Up to 76% of the early medieval gene pool in eastern England suddenly became continental northern European. This proves that the Anglian migration wasn't just some small raiding party. It was absolutely massive in scale. Their numbers were so vast that they eventually dwarfed groups like the Jutes, establishing a totally dominant demographic presence in their new home. And that genetic data gives us this really beautiful humanizing detail, too. Women of immigrant origin were migrating in ratios equal to men. That is a huge deal. It perfectly backs up the reality that the Angles arrived fully intending to farm and settle the land permanently. They were literally moving entire families, bringing their whole way of life across the ocean just to escape the rising tides back home. So when they actually hit the beaches in Britain, did they just randomly mix in with the Saxons? Not at all. As we can see, they settled in very strict, distinct geographical zones. The Angles carved out these massive territories up in the north and east, ultimately founding heavyweight kingdoms like Northumbria, Mercia, and East Anglia. Meanwhile, the Saxons took the south and west, and the Jutes, who were definitely in the minority, settled pretty firmly down in Kent. So yes, they crossed the sea in the same historical wave, but they kept their territorial boundaries totally distinct. And we know for a fact they kept their communities separated because the Angles maintain a very specific, very distinct material culture. Their relationship with the Saxons and Jutes was very much a good fences make good neighbors situation, rather than some immediate melting pot. Archaeologists can spot an Anglian cemetery a mile away just by looking at their unique jewelry. We're talking cruciform brooches and these highly distinctive wrist clasps they used to secure the sleeves of their traditional peplos dresses. They absolutely held on to their unique cultural identity, and for sure their fashion sense. But this begs a really big question. What about their relationship with the native Celtic Britons who were already living there? For decades, the standard textbook assumption was that these Germanic tribes rolled in and enforced this rigid, violent apartheid system, basically wiping out or entirely segregating the locals. But guess what? Brand new scientific evidence tells a much more nuanced, complex story. Check this out. Genetic reconstructions from early medieval cemeteries, like the Buckland site near Dover, show that within just a few short generations, the continental migrants and the assimilated native locals were frequently intermarrying. They were literally sharing grave sites, starting mixed families, and blending biologically way faster than any strict apartheid model would ever allow for. And honestly, this complex assimilation is perfectly highlighted by this one prominent, super high-status burial found in Cambridgeshire. They found this wealthy woman buried with all these diagnostic, very Anglian immigrant artifacts. And, oh yeah, an entire cow. But here's the crazy twist. Her DNA revealed she actually had majority local Western British ancestry. This is huge because it proves that status in these brand new Anglian kingdoms wasn't strictly gatekept by Germanic genetics. Local Britons could, and absolutely did, assimilate right up into the highest possible echelons of the new culture. Now, despite all that local blending in certain spots, there is a pretty heartbreaking linguistic irony that played out on a larger scale. The invading Germanic tribes categorized the native Celtic populations using the Old English term Wales, and you know what that translates to? Foreigner or stranger. Just think about that for a second. The absolute newcomers were calling the native inhabitants the foreigners, and wild enough, that word, Wales, eventually evolved into the modern word Wales. So, while some folks definitely integrated, this overarching social subordination forced a huge number of Celtic Britons to straight up flee. They were systematically driven off those rich, arable eastern plains, which was exactly the farming land the Angles were after, and pushed out into the rougher western mountains. A ton of them even fled the island entirely, establishing new Celtic colonies over in Brittany, France, and even a settlement called Bretonnia, all the way down in Spain. It was a massive, tragic dislocation that forever fragmented their common Brittonic language. Over the next few centuries, those early, messy, tribal boundaries really started to harden. By the 7th century, the island had basically consolidated into the Heptarchy, which is just a fancy term for 7 independent Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. And it was exactly during this period of relative stability that this incredibly fascinating cultural shift happened in how these people actually viewed themselves. Let's look at the 8th century. You've got famous chroniclers, like the Northumbrian monk Bede, writing down the history of this new society. And what's absolutely amazing is that Bede referred to the actual geopolitical administration of the region as Saxonia, totally acknowledging who held the political power. But when he talked about their shared language and their unified national identity across all these mixed Germanic peoples, he called it English, a term derived straight from the Angles. So I want to leave you with this final, really provocative thought to investigate further. How incredibly wild is it that a quiet tribe of farmers virtually ignored by Roman historians who were literally just fleeing rising sea levels in the Dark Ages managed to pull this off? They completely reshaped a foreign island, integrated with its locals, totally outshone their famous Saxon neighbors culturally, and immortalized their very own name in history as England. It is such a powerful testament to the fact that the most profound historical changes often don't come from the loudest, flashiest conquerors, but from everyday families who were simply looking for a stable piece of land to call home.